Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today we're here for the second part of our conversation, my conversation with Doctors Moshe Hoffman and Erez Yoeli about their book, Hidden Games, The Surprising Power of Game Theory to Explain Irrational Human Behavior. So, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us again.
So, last time we talked about some of the topics you cover there. This time, let's start perhaps with strategic ignorance. So, what is this?
Strategic ignorance is a term we use to describe when somebody is failing to find out about an opportunity to help others. So, for instance, suppose that one has been involved in a bit of risky sexual behavior, but knowing that avoids going to get tested for STDs. That is an example of strategic ignorance, because if one would go to get tested for STDs, one could then act on that behavior and protect one's partner, well, act on that information and protect one's partner in the event that one does indeed have an STD. And the ironic thing here is, of course, that if one finds out, for instance, that one has HIV, one probably would be very careful and use protection and so on. But then one isn't being careful by finding out in the first place.
Sorry. I just want to add Jason Dana and I guess some co-authors have some very nice kind of lab experiments on this. You remember the title of that paper?
Exploiting moral wiggle room.
Yeah. But are there specific circumstances where people choose to be strategically ignorant?
Yeah, I think you see it a lot. So I'll give you two stories from our life. One is, one time we wanted to do something on the roof at a lab that Moshe and I were research scientists at, and we mentioned it to the PI, to the principal investigator, and his response was, no, don't tell me, don't ask. So he's clearly, like, he knows that if he's asked, he has to say something specific or maybe forbid it. He doesn't want to be in the position where he has to forbid it, and so he says, basically, if I don't know about it, I can't forbid it. And then you can go ahead and do whatever you want. There's another great story. There's a great example of this from the Trump era, where I don't remember the congressman in question. I can look it up, but the reporter asked the congressman, "Hey, did you see Trump's latest tweet?" And the congressman says, "Do you want to comment on it?" And the congressman says, "I haven't seen it." And the reporter says, "Do you want to see it? I can show it to you." And the congressman says, "No, if I don't see it, then I can't comment on it."
Yeah, well, I mean, another real life example from the Trump era was COVID testing. Trump was purposely, you remember this one, purposely kind of trying to make it hard for people to get tested so that the numbers would remain low.
Yeah, I also remember that one, even though I'm from Portugal, but I've heard about it. Yeah.
Right. And as that example illustrates, as well as like Erez's example of HIV testing is sometimes the strategic avoidance of information can have real social negative ramifications. So in the case of COVID testing, people don't know whether or not they have COVID. It might help Trump's numbers or might make it look better for Trump, like it's less of an issue. But it also means that like people can't be as careful about avoiding spreading it to their friends. And obviously the same with HIV. If you don't, But can I just ask you, Ricardo, were you asking us for real life examples, or you wanted to know kind of at a more theoretical level when we predict?
That's a good point, because I was going for the second one. I mean, I was trying to understand the theoretical aspect of it.
Maybe let me try and address that, which is, we think at least that strategic ignorance is being driven by, obviously not consciously, but at a non-conscious level, the reason why strategic ignorance works is because it kind of gives us plausible deniability. It makes it not a lot harder for kind of other people to know for sure, and for it to be common knowledge that we're behaving selfishly. If I can't, if you avoid knowing your test results, or avoid reading Trump's tweets, there's some chance that you just didn't have a good opportunity to collect that information. You didn't quite realize what high risk you were at for having HIV, or you didn't, you were actually too busy that day to like read through his tweets. And even if I know that you weren't actually too busy, or that like you had easy access to a test, it's harder to make that common knowledge. It's less likely that other third parties know it. And we make the case that a lot of norm enforcement, a lot of the ability for people to punish you for misbehaving, for acting selfishly, really depends both on our first order knowledge, whether I know that you did it intentionally, but also on higher order knowledge, whether I think other people will know that too, because norm enforcement requires coordinating with other participants, with other people, other potential observers. And so we think that like strategic ignorance is going to be particularly built into our moral intuitions, as it's like less problematic to remain strategically ignorant than to knowingly transgress, in cases where norm enforcement is playing a big role in shaping our moral intuitions. And so when it's more about like private personal choices where there isn't like morality and norm enforcement at play, we think people would be more likely to collect the personally pertinent information.
So for instance, if you're going to visit your grandmother, then you're going to go ahead and get tested for COVID. That's a case where you're not relying on norm enforcement really to make your decisions. You're relying on whether you want to get your grandmother sick.
And if the disease that you're testing for, instead of it being something that's transmitted through sex and may therefore have moral ramifications on your sex life, but instead it's, I don't know, Huntington's disease, which there's some evidence that people are strategically ignorant about collecting data there, we would at least predict that there'd be less of at least this underlying motivation for remaining strategically ignorant. Now, there may be other reasons why people purposely avoid information, like some kind of hedonic hacking story. It feels bad to know that you have Huntington's disease, so maybe some non-functional motivation is causing us to avoid that information. But at least we would at least predict that this kind of norm enforcement non-conscious motive will only play a role in the kind of social, in the moral domain where you have to avoid kind of spreading the disease to others. But I guess as with all our predictions, things are a bit messy in the real world. So even Huntington's disease, if I know I have Huntington's disease, there still might be social moral ramifications to that. Like, if I'm on a dating website trying to, find somebody to have a long-term relationship with, and I know that I have a disease that will be debilitating in the future, I might feel obliged to reveal that, and that might, hurt my chances of finding a long-term partner, And so even there might be a moral, norm enforcement component that prevents me from wanting to collect that information. But at least in general, we'd predict that to the extent that it's more of a private, personal choice versus a moral, social ramifications, there'd be less strategic ignorance.
Mm-hmm. So something we didn't touch on last time was learning. What is learning from the perspective of game theory, and are there specific types or kinds of learning that we can have a better understanding of through game theory?
Well, me or you?
You go, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem. We were just covering this with our students. So the reason we talk about learning in a book about game theory is because in order to use game theory, one is generally going to need to assume that the players are optimizing in some way. There are various ways one could optimize. The standard way that people think about when they're using game theory is, they're thinking really hard. So there's some CEOs and they're helpers and they're all in the room, in the boardroom, thinking hard about making, pricing decisions or where to place a plant or something like that. Or, President Obama and his advisors are getting together to figure out what to do about Afghanistan or Russia or whatever. lots of smart people collecting careful information, going through this deliberative process to find the optimal solution. That's one way to optimize, but it turns out that there are other ways to optimize. One, we use game theory to talk about animal behavior too, and there we're not relying on the animals to be doing the optimization in a conscious way. We're relying on evolution. And what we do in the book is we look at domains where, okay, it's not really conscious deliberation that's doing the work. We're talking about people's preferences and beliefs, how things like strategic ignorance, which obviously they're not thinking through, they're kind of doing it at an intuitive level. That we're also not talking about things that necessarily biologically evolved. We're talking about things that they may have learned over the course of their lifetime. And so instead, there's this third process, learning, that we think is probably doing the optimizing in their case. And there's various ways people learn. There's various ways in which this optimization process or these optimization processes work. One simple one is reinforcement learning, where you do something, you wear a shirt and you see what happens and you then respond to that information. Maybe people give you compliments, and if they do, you're more likely to wear the shirt again. Or maybe they tell you, hey, like that shirt's a bit big on you, isn't it? And then you're like, oh, okay, maybe I should go get it tailored, or maybe I should not wear it as much. And so you do the behavior more or less depending on the feedback that you get. Reinforcement learning has this long, interesting history of being studied, going back to Skinner and pigeons and stuff. And we could definitely talk about some interesting results there. If you go on YouTube and you look at pictures of videos of animals doing funny circus tricks, the way we get them there is through reinforcement learning. We give them snacks and stuff every time they do a little piece of it, and eventually they're the pig is able to wheel a wheelbarrow around and like help you with your yard chores. So that's one way of learning, but there's other ways. We're perfectly capable of learning from others' experience, not just our own. We do this through imitation. And the important part there is that we don't imitate randomly. We imitate when it kind of makes sense to imitate. We imitate people who are more prestigious or strategies that have been more successful. When we imitate somebody else's clothing, we don't just look at anybody and be like, oh, I'm going to buy that shirt. We look at somebody who's a fashion icon like Michelle Obama or George Clooney, and we're like, oh, that guy, he knows how to dress, or that outfit got a lot of compliments and I kind of like it. I think it would look good on me. Maybe I'll try it. And so there again, what we're seeing is that the things that are more successful are becoming more common. That's that optimization that's going on. As soon as it's going on, we can then rely on it when we're using game theory. And in the book, there's one additional step that I've kind of glossed over, and that's that we do some work to establish that our preferences and beliefs are indeed learned, and that they have these sort of functional, that they are functional, and they do seem somewhat optimized in the ways that one would expect if that they were learned.
Yeah. Do you, in any of that kind of learning and perhaps the way people are in some ways biased, so for example, paying attention to prestigious people and so on, does it have an evolutionary / biological component to it, or do you tackle it just from a game theoretical perspective? Because that kind of bias could have been any other, I imagine, or not.
I think I understand your question. I'll try, and if Mo can jump in if he's got another idea. But the link to biology is that there's this like intermediate system. Ultimately, like we evolved to do stuff that increases our fitness, right? And so what we're doing here is we're relying on the learning systems that don't directly necessarily maximize fitness, but instead what they're doing is maximizing things that might be related, very closely related to fitness. So those are things like comfort or power or access to food, as we already heard, or access to mating opportunities, things like that. All of those things historically would have correlated with fitness, but they aren't fitness per se. And so there is this biological basis. And we know that in animals, the learning system is there because that allows the animal to react to changing environments in a way that allows them to maximize fitness faster. If the only feedback they got is whether they increased their fitness, it would be too late to react in a lot of cases. You'd have to wait a whole lifetime before basically you knew whether the things that you did worked. And so instead, you maximize stuff that gives you feedback a little bit sooner, like, are you really cold and about to freeze to death, or did you have sex? And those things will then correlate with fitness pretty tightly, though not necessarily perfectly, and that allows the animal to react in a time frame that's somewhat more helpful. A similar thing is going on here, and that's the tie to for humans, and that's the tie to biology. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Would you like to add anything to that, Dr. Hoffman?
Yeah, I would just say, just to kind of add or to clarify, our learning system itself evolved because, as Erez is describing, it's kind of, it's a good way to get animals to do things that are functional is to kind of give them this set of primary rewards to pursue and to shape what they're able to learn and do, things like access to mates or food or security, and design a whole learning system that can use these rewards to shape the behavior, so long as those rewards tend to correlate with fitness, and it's easy to get information about progress towards those rewards throughout the course of the animal's lifetime. That's a pretty good system to set up for an animal. And so these kind of learning systems like reinforcement learning have evolved, but once they evolve, they somewhat take on a life of their own. So like with some of the examples Erez pointed out, like access to sexual opportunities, that can still shape what we learn and be something that we pursue, even though in our day and age it's disconnected from fitness. So we like sex and we pursue sex even when birth control is involved, and so it's been disconnected to some extent from reproductive success, and yet, because of its historic relationship with reproductive success, we've still kind of evolved both that taste, but also presumably its ability to shape other things that we learn by association with, every time I wear this shirt, like it does well for my dating life, like that can cause you to like start liking that shirt or that style of dress. Again, there's some connection to evolution, but that connection is, kind of a step away.
Yeah. So one kind of game that you talk about and explore in the book is the hawk-dove game. Could you tell us about it and what kinds of situations it applies to, or we can apply it to?
The hawk-dove game is a game with two players. They are. It's designed to illustrate a situation in which they're competing over some sort of valued resource. The players can choose between two actions. They can be aggressive over the resource, or they can acquiesce. They can play hawk or dove. And then we grant them payoffs based on those actions. So if you've been aggressive, if you've played hawk and I've played dove, you get the resource, I don't. If vice versa, if I've played hawk and you've played dove, then I get the resource. If we both play dove, then you take. Okay, let's split it. So we say, okay, 50-50 chance, or you get the resource, or you get half, I get half. And then the interesting case, of course, is what happens when we both play hawk, we're both aggressive over it. Well, then we assume that a fight breaks out and there's some cost to fighting. And there's a 50% chance you win, a 50% chance I win. We can adjust that. Sometimes we do, but for simplicity, assume it's 50-50. And also, each of us pays the cost of fighting. And so each of us gets V over 2, the V being the value of the good, divided by 2, 50-50 chance of getting it, but also minus C, that cost of fighting. So that's the game. And this game has as if you make one assumption, which is that the cost of fighting is kind of big, that the resource is valuable, but not so valuable that you'll fight for it no matter what, basically, which technically speaking means you're assuming V over 2 is less than C. Then
wait, you said what V and C was? I'm sorry.
Yeah, C is the cost of fighting, V is the value of the good. And if you assume that that cost is sufficiently high, there are two Nash equilibria of this game. I play Hawk, you play Dove. You play Hawk, I play Dove. And the interesting thing there that arises then is that anything that influences our expectations over who is going to play Hawk, that is going to have an outsized effect on our behavior. So if I expect you to play Hawk, then I'm just going to acquiesce, and vice versa. And if there's some random thing that causes me to expect you to play Hawk, then I'm going to pay very close attention to that, and I'm going to abide by it. It's kind of self-reinforcing. So, the classic example of this is in animal territoriality. This is what the game was developed for. And two animals show up at a resource, and a fight breaks out. But in fact, it's not a real fight. Instead, what happens is the animal that arrived second just kind of like gives up after a few seconds and runs away. And this is a classic thing that we observe. And basically what's happening there is that who arrived first, which has no real influence on the value of the resource to the two animals, or who might win the fight, who is stronger, things like that. But it's determining their intuitions over who the resource belongs to, and the animal that arrived second is automatically playing Dove, and the animal that arrived first is automatically playing Hawk as a consequence. So that thing that determining expectations is playing that outsized role.
Can we understand where certain rights come from by applying this kind of game?
Yeah, Mo, you want to talk for a bit? No.
I can. If you prefer, then I'm happy to.
No, yeah, go ahead.
So just as Erez is saying with animal territoriality, some arbitrary cue, if it shifts both of our expectations, it can be self-fulfilling. With animal territoriality, that's kind of who arrived first. With humans, who arrived first also sometimes influences our expectations over who's gonna defend kind of a resource. If you imagine you come to a movie theater and there's a jacket sitting on one of the seats, you might assume, well, I guess somebody else already got to the seat. I guess it's theirs. And so our intuition about like mine and thine is also somewhat shaped by something very similar to animal territoriality. It's kind of like expectation that whoever's jacket is there, somehow laid claim to this place. And there's no law that like, will support you. So, if I remove your jacket and sit down, like you're not going to like call the police on me. But like, I might expect that you're going to behave a little bit aggressively once you get back from the bathroom. And, and it's probably not worth it for me to get in a fight with you over this like stupid seat. I'll just go sit somewhere else. And so, for the same reason of animals are territorial, we also have cues like putting down your jacket that kind of dictate our sense of in this case, property rights, like if you have a temporary right over this seat. But the same kind of logic can apply to other notions of rights. Now, obviously, it gets more complicated once we talk about rights that are very culturally evolved and have like many other ramifications, like this idea that I don't know. We all have let's take for instance, I guess maybe we don't need to get into too much history on like the progress of rights, because obviously a lot more is going on there. But the only point we want to say is that like if everybody believes that certain people have certain rights to certain things, that can also be self-fulfilling, just like the jacket in the movie theater, to the extent that it motivates people to then fight for those rights. And a government looking to abuse those rights, or a subset of the population looking to disrespect those rights, they can expect pushback if they do so. And maybe sometimes there's enough collective action to cause change, or the authoritarian regime has enough power to overlook these expectations. So, there's other things going on that shape our sense of rights. But one important thing is that if everybody kind of believes in a certain right, that has some self-fulfilling effect.
Yeah. Another specific thing that you cover in the book has to do with apology. So why is it that after you've done something bad to someone, after you broke a promise or something like that, you apologize? And not all the time, of course, it depends, but sometimes at least it works. I mean, why would it be the case?
The apology is fundamentally just influencing expectations over whether somebody can play hawk over something. So if I did something wrong to you, I didn't show up when I told you to, or I wasted your time in some way, like I did this morning. I'm sorry, with our Skype snafu. Then you can by apologizing, what you're basically saying is I actually don't have a right over your time in that way. So I do not have the ability to just disregard your time. And I don't intend to do that again in the future. And if I do, you would be able to get mad at me, and so on and so forth. So it's an indication of who has kind of the ability to, who's expected to play hawk in that context. And an apology is a symbolic gesture. It does, it's just words, but it has the ability to set expectations over who will play hawk, and so it can work to do that. We do talk about when an apology has to be costly and so on in the book, but like in the example that we just gave, where I made a mistake, I screwed up and wasn't ready with Skype, and then it took a long time, it wasted your time and things like that, and then I say I'm sorry. Well, in that case, an apology can work. You can kind of expect me to not waste your time in the future, and it can kind of reset the relationship, and we can continue.
And what are the specific situations or circumstances where an apology has to be more costly for it to work?
So an apology can be costless when the person making the apology hasn't really benefited from the transgression. So, for example, this morning, I was wasting your time, but I was also wasting my time, right? Clearly I didn't benefit from the fact that I couldn't figure out how to log into Skype. And so I don't really need for a cost to be associated with that apology, because I didn't really benefit from the transgression in any way. There are other cases where if I wasted your time, it was because I was doing something that benefited me or something like that. And there, maybe it's more likely you will need a costly apology, because if you can get away with, it's not really a natural equilibrium for somebody to transgress and then apologize. They'll just take that option every single time, unless the apology, if the transgression has a benefit to them, unless the apology comes with a cost that's greater than the benefit to them. And so if you do something to your partner that you don't show up, or maybe you've flirted with somebody else or something like that, there you have a benefit to you, and then oftentimes in those cases we're going to expect the apology to be more costly. A concrete example of this that we use in the book comes from The Sopranos. So Tony and his wife, whose name I'm totally blanking on, are estranged. Basically, what has happened is that his wife has gotten sick of Tony's constant affairs, and they finally meet up after a while to try to chat. And his wife basically says, "Listen, hint, hint, there's this house I want, hint, hint." And Tony says, "Great, I'll call my accountant. And now what?" And the wife says, "Well, you can move back in."
Yeah. So changing topics, and now a completely different thing, I guess. Why do people buy luxury items?
Oh, because they look cool.
There has to be another deeper explanation.
Thank you. You're doing our work for us. So there's a classic model in both econ and biology called the costly signaling model, which is typically used to explain where this preference for blingy or luxurious things comes from. Lamborghinis, Rolexes, fancy leather bags, stuff with LV, emblazoned on it in 20 different ways, things like that. The model was developed simultaneously by Michael Spence to explain, actually he was using it to explain fancy degrees. So why does somebody go get an English degree from Harvard? There aren't a lot of life skills that they learn that will benefit them in the workplace later. Why don't they learn something like engineering or, something more practical? So that was the question that motivated him. And at the same time, there's this guy, Amos Zahavi, who is a biologist who was studying ostentatious displays in animals like the peacock's long tail. And both of them kind of came up with the same answer. If we use the peacock example, the answer is something along the lines of there are different kinds of peacocks. Some of those peacocks are more desirable than others, and in particular, some are fitter than others. They're better able to evade predators or groom themselves or whatever it is that is making them fitter. And the peahen wants to mate with a peacock that is fit and doesn't really want to mate with one that isn't fit. Mating with a peacock that isn't fit is a recipe for having offspring that are unhealthy, and she wouldn't want to invest the resources in that. She really only wants to invest them if the peacock is fit. But she can't observe fitness. It's not like the peacock is walking around with a sign that says my fitness level is 79.4, that peacock is 34.7, then she could choose, right? She has to somehow make this decision by looking at the peacock, and that's it, without more information. And so what happens is that the nature has found this interesting way of effectively separating out those peacocks who are healthier from those who aren't, who are fitter from those who aren't. And that's that it's given them the option, the strategy, to use our language from game theory, of either growing a long tail or not. And a long tail is metabolically difficult to grow. It's hard to prune. It makes the animal less mobile, and so it's harder to evade predators. And so it's this costly thing that the animal can do. And both animals could, in theory, do it, but only the fit one can really afford to do it without basically dying from disease or from being eaten by a predator. And so what ends up happening is only the fit peacocks grow the tails. The unfit peacocks don't grow them, or grow ones that are a lot less long. The peahen only finds attractive those peacocks that have very long tails, and this is a Nash equilibrium. And in this Nash equilibrium, notice the peacock is growing this useless thing and passing it on to their offspring. And it's this useless thing that is just burning the key resource that the peahen cares about. But it's still a Nash equilibrium for that to happen because of the fact that it allows for that separation between the unfit and the fit peacocks. And we use the same model to explain things like, people like fancy cars, or people like blingy watches or things like that. They're, again, there's some thing that people differ on. In the classic case, it's wealth. There's somebody who's interested in how wealthy you are. You don't have a sign with your bank account on your forehead, and so there's some other way that you kind of indicate. And obviously what your wealth level is. Maybe it's a Rolex. The guy who's got a big bank account, he can walk around with a Rolex. I can't. And so people who are interested in talking to or meeting with or whatever, people who are just wealthier, can very easily find those people and ignore me. And then the thing that I think makes this interesting is that people will signal underlying traits other than wealth, and that there's this kind of game that arises where you're like, okay, but what's being signaled by this particular signal? So if we're talking about wine snobs, well, wine snobbery is to some extent signaling wealth because wine is expensive, but not all wines are that expensive. And most of us can afford to buy a pretty decent bottle of wine pretty regularly, even if we're not that wealthy. And so it's not just a signal of, well, what is it? Well, there I think what's happening is probably people are signaling access to certain social resources, somebody who can train you to talk about wine in the right ways and appreciate it in the right ways. And that's, the fact that you have that upbringing or the fact that you have those people in your social network is also something that people valued and can't see on your forehead. And so when you go to dinner and you behave in a way that makes it clear that you are knowledgeable about wine, they learn something about you that's different from somebody else who can't talk about wine in the right way. So that's a nice signal, but it's not just a signal of wealth, and so on and so forth. We can play this game forever. There's lots of interesting signals.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps sometimes there's also other traits that are signaled, or at least that people interpret them as such, like, for example, certain psychological traits. When you have lots of money, people many times tend to think that you are perhaps intelligent and conscientious and all of that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the signal is signaling multiple things at once, as you're suggesting. Mm-hmm. Some signals seem particularly well tuned to like differentiate, to like not signal wealth, but to signal like a particular trait. And so like, I think that when we look at hipsters and the kinds of things they like, they're signaling all the time too, but they're not signaling wealth. They're signaling access to actually, they're probably signaling a few things like cleverness or creativity and so on. Sometimes it's things like access to social resources. So the idea that they know people who you don't, they know the coolest people, and therefore they find out about things the fastest. I mean, this is a big part of like a more hipsterized culture. I knew them before they were cool. That kind of thing, and so they're instead of the signaling lots of things at once, it's actually kind of including wealth. It's actually trying to separate wealth out from those other things.
Yeah. So another thing then, why do people sometimes hide a positive trait or achievement? What do they have to gain from that?
So this is somewhat ironic. I just want to highlight how ironic this is before I answer your question.
Okay.
So we just spent like 5 minutes talking about costly signals and how people use these signals to help people identify attractive things about them. Other people want to know them. You want them to know that. And then the obvious question that arises is the one that you just raised, which is that a lot of times people actually are modest about stuff or understated, and they don't highlight stuff. In fact, we think they're tacky if they do. And so why is that happening? I always have this thought when we're teaching about costly signaling, about when we tell our students this, and then they respond, but wait, like, when somebody asks us if we go to Harvard, we like actually kind of try to avoid telling them that at first. And there's this like game that gets played. And then eventually, like, if they keep persisting, we'll tell them we go to Harvard. But first we say, like, we go to school in Boston, things like that. And so, like, obviously we're not trying to signal this too hard. And the way that we explain this is actually just a tweak on the model. You take that same costly signaling model and you think about the fact that, like, sometimes what people want to signal is something about their motives or the kind of person they're interested in. So I'm in this for the long run, or I'm in this for the right reasons and not just to like attract anybody. And in those cases, but by hiding your attractive trait, you're actually sending a signal that I'm trying to avoid attracting the attention of everybody, which is costly because the attention of everybody is somewhat valuable, right? Like, I'd like for everybody to know about my good deeds and also the particular people I particularly care about. But what you're doing is saying, I'm willing to forgo attention from lots of people so that others will realize how much I value them. And that that's a valid costly signal. It's a Nash equilibrium, just like any other costly signal, and consequently that can arise. And so we see this burying behavior, is what we call it in the book, or modesty is what we call it colloquially, arising as a Nash equilibrium when people particularly care about matching with certain individuals and kind of want to hint at that. And there's a risk to it, that there's a risk that people won't recognize, hence the cost.
Yeah. So changing topics and talking about another kind of game that you also explore in the book, what is an evidence game and why do people play them?
Mo is running back. Mo, your turn.
No, you're explaining things so well. I'm happy to listen and chime in when I have something to add, if you don't mind.
You're supposed to quit when you're ahead. An evidence game is another kind of signaling game. The way that you model it, again, is you have receivers and senders. The sender will move first and is going to send some sort of signal. But the thing about an evidence game is that the signals work really differently from the costly signaling model. So in a costly signaling model, you walk into a store and there's a fancy coat and you can decide whether or not to buy it. And in an evidence game, what's happening is that you actually are the one generating evidence. And so the game is all about like how one generates evidence, how one passes that evidence along, how one generates it. And so the evidence is assumed to work a little bit differently. You are basically going to be able to, you're not going to be able to fake evidence. That's really important in these games. But you are going to be able to verify when you get evidence. And the key thing that you can mess with is how you obtain that evidence. So you can either pass that evidence along or not when you have it. And you can invest in obtaining that evidence in different ways. And so that's theoretically what's going on. The thing that these games are designed to get at is how people spin when it comes to say politics, or in an interview, or on a first date, or things like that. So they're not going to just flat out lie typically, unless they're Trump. But most people are going to abide by norms against lying, because presumably because you kind of get punished pretty hard for lying. But they are able to do things like, if they know that they did something wrong, they don't necessarily need to communicate that, or if they know that there's certain think about somebody in the courtroom, and they know that the bloody knife is buried in the backyard, but they don't have to say that. So the bloody knife is the evidence, but they can decide whether or not to pass that evidence on. On the other hand, maybe they know on the first date something attractive about them, like they were the valedictorian in their class, they can pass that on. So they can decide whether to pass it on. They can also decide how to generate evidence. So if they're if we're thinking about somebody who's like a climate denialist, or maybe the Trump administration, when it comes to Kavanaugh's hearing, that was a good example of this. They can decide how hard to dig into evidence. So that they dug very hard into evidence about his accusers, but not very hard into evidence about him. They didn't want to uncover any bad news about Kavanaugh, but they were perfectly happy to uncover bad news about the accuser. So what you're doing there is basically there's certain information that is passed on to the sender, from the sender to the receiver, that's verifiable, namely the evidence. But there's certain information that can't really be passed on, like how hard you searched, or whether you have the evidence in the first place. And that asymmetry between what is passed on and what isn't passed on, what's private information and what isn't, is what generates all the interesting results in these games.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk now about the prisoner's dilemma. But I wanted to get specifically into the repeated prisoner's dilemma, but perhaps we have first to explain what is the prisoner's dilemma game, and in what ways does it compare to real life interactions?
The prisoner's dilemma is a really, really simple way of highlighting that what's socially optimal isn't necessarily individually optimal. The idea that one can sometimes take costly actions to benefit others or to benefit society, those actions have a cost to you and a benefit to somebody else. And so we write a simple game in which there are two players. Those two players are deciding between cooperation or defection, cooperate or defect, C or D. And if you play C, it costs you something. It costs you little c, but benefits the other by B. And we write out the payoffs of that game. And sadly, there's just one Nash equilibrium of the game, which is that neither player defects. Why? Because if I cooperate, then regardless of what you're doing, I can eschew cooperation and as a consequence, save myself the cost C. It screws you. You lose B, but that's not my payoff. That's, my payoff is that C, and so I can do better by switching to defect. I can always do better by switching to defect, and so that's the only Nash equilibrium. And fortunately, the things don't end there, as you hinted at. Things can kind of be fixed, and we can see cooperation. But in order to see cooperation, we have to change the game in some way. And one of the fundamental ways people change the game is by having it repeat. This idea that we might interact again, there might be some opportunity to help you again in the future, and so that might influence players' incentive to cooperate, or provide a way for players to actually get cooperation off the ground. The way that game is done is we simply play the prisoner's dilemma, then with some probability delta, we interact again and play the prisoner's dilemma. With some probability, we play it again. And, if we don't play it again, then the game just ends and we get 0 forever after. And in that game, there are now cooperative equilibria, and they arise only under the condition that the future is sufficiently important, that delta, that likelihood of interacting again, is sufficiently high, and they also have some key characteristics. The most important being that in equilibrium, if you have cooperation, it has to be the case that if the cooperation is conditional in some way on past behavior. So the idea that, like, if you were good to me in the past, I'm more likely to be good to you in the future. If you're not good to me in the past, I'm less likely to be good to you in the future. And there are lots of cooperative equilibria, but they all must have that key feature.
But what results do we tend to get from those games? Do people tend to cooperate more or less than expected?
I think that the key thing that we learn is kind of what cooperation, what features it tends to have. So maybe not more. Well, we get one key piece of information about when people will cooperate, but we also get some information about the characteristics of our cooperative tendencies, our intuition. So for instance, we do get information about people being more willing to cooperate in settings where they're going to matter more in the future. So in relationships that matter more, or they're going to be less cooperative in anonymous situations, for instance, because the future is basically disconnected from the present due to that anonymity. So that directly addresses your question. But in addition to that kind of perhaps almost obvious result, there are some additional results I think are really interesting. We're going to care a lot about things like higher order beliefs, which have come up already in this discussion, and common knowledge. So in the repeated prisoner's dilemma, I have to punish you if you've screwed me, but punishing you kind of sucks because it often sends us down this path of tit for tat is one way that this happens, or there are other strategies like grim trigger, which are even worse, where I never will cooperate with you ever again, and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I kind of like to avoid that, and so suppose that you defected by accident. You meant to press this lever, but you pressed this other lever. I know that it was an accident. I also know that you didn't even notice. Well, in that case, I'm going to be like, I'm not going to follow the strategy. I'm not going to go ahead and punish this person because you didn't even know that you defected. And so in that case, what we can do is stay on the cooperative path by me not punishing. And what that highlights is the fact that if I'm going to punish a transgression, I'm only going to do it when I know that you know that you transgressed. Notice I know you know, that higher order belief, or that role of common knowledge is entered. So one thing that's really important is this role of common knowledge. And as soon as the role of common knowledge is important, as soon as that there's that, like, we need to be coordinated on whether transgression occurred, and as soon as that element is critical, all of these different quirky behaviors associated with common knowledge, like strategic ignorance, for instance, are going to play an important role. And that can be true for the simple repeated prisoner's dilemma. It can also be true for models that build off of the prisoner's dilemma, but complicate it for instance, like norm enforcement models, which have more than two players and aren't just about bilateral relationships, but are about how, like, humans achieve cooperation in groups. One thing I really like about the repeated prisoner's dilemma is, even by analyzing this very simple game, you can start to pick out these features of cooperation that are going to be somewhat universal and somewhat constant across these various settings where cooperation is important or arising.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask you about norms now. So in the book, you distinguish between continuous and categorical norms. Could you tell us about that distinction and how each of them arises?
Sure. Mo, you want to jump in?
I don't know. I guess I've done 3 or 4 of these interviews with Ricardo already, so I'm pretty happy to let his audience hear your take. But so far, I've agreed with everything you've said and didn't feel a need to jump in. But if you don't mind, keep chatting. I think it's great.
Yeah. All right.
But maybe the one thing that I wanted to jump in, but it was more just a prod to you, is before going on to norms, maybe it's worth, unless Ricardo was saving this for later, you briefly mentioning how you use some of the altruism theory in more applied settings to actually induce pro-social behavior. I don't know, Ricardo, did you have a question along those lines later on, or maybe now's a good time for Erez to...
Yeah, perhaps it's better for us to tackle it now. Yeah.
Cool.
Sure. So we were building up to the fact that thanks to our analysis of games like the repeated prisoner's dilemma or norm enforcement games that are a little bit more complicated with more players, one can kind of characterize the conditions under which cooperation will arise and the key characteristics that cooperative equilibria will have. And that's a bunch of mumbo jumbo. And if you told the CEO, I can do that, he'd be like, I don't care. What he wants to know is, but how do we get, like, people to actually be more cooperative? So you need to do some work to translate the lessons of the model to something that's actually actionable and interpretable to the average person. The things that we found are most useful are 3 key characteristics that cooperation has. And I'm going to use the mumbo jumbo, and then I'll translate it. So one is observability is really important. If I know that a transgression, if a transgression happened, but I can't know about it, then it's like it didn't happen. Like, I can't act on it. I can't condition my future cooperation on information I don't have. And so it's really critical that potential transgressions be something that people can find out about. That's observability. From a practical standpoint, the obvious lesson to that is, if you make things more observable, people will be more likely to be cooperative. We've used this, for instance, just like, a very simple example of this is, many years ago, we worked with a power company to try to prevent blackouts. And they have these programs where you can sign up and somebody comes to your house, they install this device that, like, basically automatically reduces your air conditioner's power consumption. And if you've been paying attention to the news, this has kind of been in the news recently because California just had a massive heat wave, and they were running out of power. In the afternoon, people go home, the ACs in the offices are still on, it's still very hot. And people are starting to turn on the ACs at home. That's a lot of power draw, and they just run out of power. So they can do various things. One of the things they did, for instance, here is they sent out an emergency alert, and people were actually pretty responsive to it. That was kind of cool. But one of the things you can do is actually automate that and install this device that basically, like, if you press a red button as the utility, those devices then draw down the power. So this is a nice cooperative behavior that one can do. You're paying some cost because you have to have the installer come over, and you have to kind of pay attention to this and, like, waste some of your time. But it benefits society as a whole by helping to prevent a blackout. So we worked with the utility to do this and immediately saw, okay, this is a cooperative situation. Are the conditions necessary for cooperation there? And we looked at the way that they were recruiting people, and we saw that what they were doing was asking people to call into a hotline. And we're like, wait a minute, there's no observability. How will anybody ever find out you've done this good deed? And so we just changed that. We didn't do it in a super high-tech way. We just had people sign up on sign-up sheets, and now their neighbors could tell whether they signed up. And we did some stuff to show that observability was actually doing the work here. We had two versions of the sign-up sheet, one which was totally anonymous, you put in a code, and one where you put your name and your apartment number and so on. We compared those two sign-up sheets, and what we found was that participation tripled in the group where behavior was more observable. That's a really big effect. It turns out empirically that actually is pretty common. Like, when we look at different studies in different settings, people often find very large effects of observability on prosocial behavior. And that once you have this perspective that the repeated prisoner's dilemma and models like it provide, that actually makes a lot of sense, because you can't really get cooperation off the ground otherwise. So that's one key practical piece.
Before you, if you were going to say more, let me just jump in and mention that, like, you could think of this as a nudge, I don't know, I'm mispronouncing it. Erez always makes fun of me for mispronouncing it. But, it is an example of a nudge, but the nudge literature has been kind of somewhat under criticism lately for, replication issues, for, having a hard time knowing when a specific nudge is going to generalize. If you show it in one setting, will it work in another? And we think, at least, that the more kind of theory motivated nudges, where the theory gives you some sense of how general this is going to be, and should motivate you into thinking that this is going to be a fairly robust, strong effect, as with observability in the pro-social domain, that it will be a more kind of robust nudge. And that's I don't, I guess what Erez was hinting at before is this one does seem to be quite robust in the literature. And he has a nice review paper that kind of looks at different nudges for pro-social behavior. And it seems as though, if I'm remembering correctly, observability is like the strongest, most robust of all the nudges that people have tried. And I don't know, tell me if I summarized that paper well, or if there's anything you want to add about that result.
No, that's how we'd summarize it. And I'd add to that, we didn't do this in the review, which focused on field studies, but if you look at the laboratory literature as well, observability effects are huge in the laboratory literature. So we're talking about, if you were to standardize them, things like, we get 50% increases in contributions, or 100% or 150%, or, it's not like 5%. These aren't marginal effects with P's of 0.06 or 0.04. These are typically very large effects. And in fact, that was a point that really motivated us to try this in the field at the time. So, today we have like a very nice theoretical perspective as to why this is working. But frankly, at the time, we weren't yet thinking so clearly about it. And what we did see was that when we looked at the lab studies, we were like, wow, these observability effects are crazy big, and there's dozens of these studies that have them. But like, would this even make sense in the field? Like, we should see if we can get this to work in the field, because if we can, that's like a pretty promising result. And since then, we're not the only ones who have done this now. And since then, other people have sort of demonstrated various ways of increasing observability successfully. So yeah, and I agree with Mo that I would be surprised if this one gets overturned by the replication folks. And I think that the theory does increase my confidence in that quite a bit. So that's all right. And anyway, going back, popping the stack, going back one to practical implications of this. So one is increased observability. there are two more conditions that we can look at through our like equilibrium analysis that end up being pretty important. One is around higher order beliefs that have come up a few times. So we've basically said in these environments there's some coordination element. We want to be on the same page on whether a transgression occurred, and as soon as there's that coordination element, common knowledge and higher order beliefs matter. Again, not something the CEO or President Obama could act on. How would one move from that to something actionable? The term we like to use for this is plausible deniability. So in the presence of plausible deniability, cooperation tends to flail. And when you eliminate plausible deniability, you kind of get everybody on the same page. And so we think of plausible deniability as kind of the colloquial way of saying, hey, I know this thing was wrong, or I know that this person shouldn't have behaved in that way, but I'm not so sure others know that. In the presence of plausible deniability, that's more likely to be true. And so the practical advice that we give is you should try to lock down plausible deniability, try to eliminate it. That can be take the form of things like don't give an opportunity for strategic ignorance, like we were talking about before. Mm-hmm. A classic example we often use is one called avoiding the ask, which is illustrated by a study in which Salvation Army volunteers would stand in front of the doors of the supermarket requesting donations, and the researchers actually varied whether or not they stood in front of one door or both doors, and basically counted whether people went out which door, and found that when they're only standing in front of one door, people go out the other door to avoid the ask. So, the practical advice there is stand in front of both doors. This can take the form of like asking people to take a pledge or make a plan in advance, which makes it harder for them to then plausibly claim that they didn't know about the opportunity or didn't know about how they would be able to help. So there's various different ways one can do this. If you're interested, actually, I just put out an HBR article on this. It's up on my website, and folks are more than welcome to check it out. Also, it's the only thing I've ever written in HBR, so I'm sure you could find it that way. And so that's the second piece of practical advice. Mo, before I move on, any additions you'd make to that one? Cool. And then the third one is we've in games like the Repeated Prisoner's Dilemma, in norm enforcement games, there are always multiple equilibria. And in particular, there's always one equilibrium in which players are not cooperative, and then there are, cooperative equilibria. And we think that this is really important because players in practice, in reality, so when you move away from the hypothetical game, but in the real world, we're not always expected to do the good thing. Think about different norms of littering. It's always better not to litter, but like some places have really strong norms against littering and some places don't. And even in societies where there are now very strong norms for littering, those are fairly new. They probably arose since World War II and oftentimes as late as 1970s or 80s in the West. And so, and even within the West, there are places where they're like stronger or weaker. And so, like,
can I jump in with a fun anecdote just for the fun of it. I don't know if it adds too much intellectually, but you remember in Japan when you made the comment to me about how Japan is even, you think that we're strict in the U.S. or in Europe. But Erez made the comment to me when we were in Japan actually working on this book about like, wow, it's so weird. We haven't seen any litter at all the whole time that we've been here. We had been there for like 2 weeks or so by then. And then like literally like an hour later, we see our first piece of litter. Like there's like a tissue, like, in the curb, in the street. And like he pointed it out and it was like sufficiently shocking because it's the first piece we saw. Literally within 5 minutes, you remember this, ready? Within 5 minutes, the store owner comes out, it picks up the litter that was, on the street in front of his store and throws it out. So just fun anecdote pointing out the variation and how strict the littering norms are.
It's also on stark display in soccer games. So when the Japanese team plays, the Japanese fans clean up the stadium after losing the game. They sit there and they clean up the stands for the other side's fans. It's pretty amazing. But going back to the game, what's probably going on here is related to the idea that you have these multiple equilibria. Sometimes you're expected to be cooperative. Sometimes you're not. Sometimes both of these are equilibrium. Both of these are self-reinforcing. And so how do I know which one I'm in right now? Am I expected to be cooperative right now or not? Am I expected to abide by a certain norm? Am I expected to not litter, or not? Both of those are possible. And so we tend to be fairly attuned to which one we're in, to whether we're expected to do a good deed in a particular setting, and we're kind of looking for cues of it. That's a big part of the psychology, is that we look for cues of when we're expected to cooperate, in addition to these other things that we were talking about. And those cues can take a lot of forms. They can be things like, I see other people engaging in the behavior. So the fact that we saw the shopkeeper engage in that behavior meant, oh, okay, we should also pick up litter when we encounter it. And people kind of naturally do that. There are these great studies that show that when you tell people, hey, lots of other people are engaging in this behavior, it's called a descriptive norm, then people tend to change their behavior as well. The classic example that's given is what everybody calls the towel study, where Noah Goldstein and his mentor, Bob Cialdini, and there's one other author, I think, on the study, and I apologize, I'm forgetting it. They did a field experiment where they took the tags on that the hotel rooms put in the bathrooms that say, please reuse your towels, and they wrote different messages on them. And one of the things they tried was, hey, lots of other people in your hotel room. It's something like 73% of hotel guests reused their towels, and they found that this had a very large effect on towel reuse rates. And this has been replicated a fair amount. But you don't have to do it this way. You can do it in other ways too. You can communicate the expectation in other ways. You can tell people, hey, like, lots of other people think that you should do this. That's called an injunctive norm. Or you can like use identity frames, which basically say, hey, like, you're a voter. You voted in the last election, you should vote in this one. And so like now you're communicating expectations in this other way, and so on and so forth. And so there's now a popular way of doing this is called a dynamic norm, where it's not a norm yet, but it's changing. And so you're communicating to people, hey, like, it's changing. So people talk about vegetarianism this way. It's not that many people are vegetarians yet, but it is a very fast growing group. And so they talk about the growth rates, and that's communicating expectations to some extent, and so on and so forth. So the practical advice we give there is, hey, like, take the opportunity to communicate expectations to folks. That's going to make it so that they realize this is a context where they're expected to cooperate, and that's going to have an effect as well. So those are the three pieces of advice we typically give: communicate working backwards, communicate expectations, eliminate plausible deniability, increase observability. And whenever we design interventions, we do work with field partners to design interventions to promote real world behaviors. And we just go through that checklist and make sure our interventions have hit as many of these elements in as many ways as we can.
But just to make clear that all of these prescriptions are both they're field tested, but they're also theoretically motivated. They're all driven by this basic model that we started with about reciprocal altruism, norm enforcement.
And that's important because like sometimes people are like, hey, you did this thing to try to motivate people to take their tuberculosis medications. Mm-hmm. Can you do that for diabetes? And we're like, wait, like our intervention in the case of tuberculosis is premised on the idea that you're not taking into account sufficiently the fact that you might get other people sick. And so we're going to design the intervention with these observability, plausible deniability, expectations things in order to get you to do that better. And sure enough, we've done this, it works. We've got these two very large field studies in Kenya that test our intervention and so on. Our latest paper on this isn't under review at the moment, but somebody looks at that and says, well, but diabetes is also a disease that's it requires in fact, it's a chronic disease, so it requires an indefinite length of treatment. Why don't you take your intervention and adapt it? But diabetes is not communicable. Mm-hmm. And so the key motivation for our intervention design is absent. There's no pro-social element there. It's all about you. Now, some of the features of our intervention may transfer over, but I wouldn't approach it in the same way. I would have to build the intervention from the ground up. And so Mo's comment about, this is theoretically motivated, it also tells us kind of the boundary conditions of when we expect our interventions to work and when not. And so, yes for pro-social, no for not pro-social behaviors. Yes for diseases that are communicable, no for diseases that are not.
Mm-hmm. So have we covered enough ground now to get into continuous versus categorical norms?
I guess I can talk for a few minutes. Let Erez get a drink of water or whatever he might need. His voice can get a breather. Using starting with the same kind of models of norm enforcement, and this idea that like common knowledge matters. There are some interesting implications about how common knowledge works and what kinds of things then can norms condition on. What kinds of things can you turn into a norm? And one key implication that comes out of the game theory is that you can only have norms that are very categorical in nature. So you can have a norm that says you can't use any chemical or biological weapons in warfare. And that norm seems to be sustainable. In fact, for as much as went wrong and became inhumane in World War II, the norm against chemical weapons stayed. Of all the rules that the Nazis were willing to break, for instance, they weren't willing to break that one because they knew that once they broke that norm, others would too, and they didn't want to have to worry about British and American chemical weapons. So that norm stayed. And we would argue that a huge reason why it stayed is because it's just so well defined. It's so categorical. It's so easy for us to agree on what the norm is and who's violated it, that it's quite easy to enforce. But if you think that like norms are just whatever is like socially efficient we can turn into a norm, there's all sorts of more continuous versions of this norm or other norms that you might imagine we would and should have, but we don't. So why don't we have a norm against just wanton killing? It turns out in wars you have all sorts of wanton killing, but what counts as wanton killing? Needless death or needless suffering. That's much harder to define, and so it's kind of harder to create and sustain a norm around that. Take another example. This one not about norms of war, but think about like going back to the domain of pro-social behavior. Think about like charitable giving behavior. So you might think, what's really important is that we have a large impact, and maybe we should just make sure that people give to the most efficient charities, or you give when it's efficient to do so. And so you might think, why don't we just have a norm that like maximizes impact and efficacy and efficiency? And if you talk to your effective altruism friends or to the utilitarians in the philosophy department, they'll tell you, yes, absolutely, this is what we should be doing. This is the only moral thing that ought to matter. But I guess we would argue, like with the norm against chemical weapons, there we argue that you really need well-defined categorical distinctions. Likewise, with charitable giving, you do, and unfortunately, efficacy and impact, that's not as well-defined or as easy for everybody to agree upon, or as categorical, and so that's a lot harder to kind of create a norm around. And we would argue that's one of the main reasons why people aren't so motivated to consider impact and efficacy when they give. It's much easier to sustain norms that say give when asked. If the person is ringing the bell in front of the grocery store and asking for charity, then you feel kind of a need to give, especially if they look you in the eye and ask you as you walk out that door, even if that charity is ineffective. So, because we have a strong norm that says when somebody asks for a favor, unless you have a good justification for not doing it, you should acquiesce. But so that's an easy norm to sustain. It's a lot harder to sustain the norm that says, well, make sure that you give your money to the most efficient charity. Okay, so that's I guess the key point that we have about categorical versus continuous, and maybe even if I may, I could point to Erez if he has any studies or things to add on how that gets applied again in the real world, or what kind of prescriptions we might have on that topic.
Prescriptions wise, I think the prescription is fairly obvious. You're going to want to take stuff that is naturally continuous and find ways to make it genuinely categorical. The obvious example of this when it comes to, for instance, efficient giving is certification. So there is this organization, GiveWell, which certifies highly impactful charities. You either get a GiveWell certification or you don't. That's categorical. Now, there are probably some charities that were kind of borderline and didn't get it, but were borderline. But that's not how certifications work. You either got it or you didn't. And it's actually fairly difficult to find out. GiveWell makes it a little easier than most certifications, but it's somewhat difficult even to find out whether a charity applied for a GiveWell certification and how they did on the assessment and so on. And so as a consequence, you've basically taken this information about how impactful the charity is, which would have been continuous. And you've actually taken away some of that information and made it categorical. You either got it or not. And so that's actually our advice. And sometimes it's easier to use this advice than other times. I remember we were working on that tuberculosis intervention, and we wanted to just recommend that people eat more vegetables. But eating more vegetables was continuous. And so we actually changed our guidance and say eat at least one vegetable a day.
Wait, eating vegetables helps fight tuberculosis? Is that
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that there is like a concern that TB patients, at least in our area, aren't eating enough vegetables, that they're not meeting their nutritional requirements. And so this was like a recommendation that the doctors we were working with had suggested. And we changed that to eat at least one vegetable once a day, which feels more categorical. You either did it or you didn't. I don't know if that works, but that's a way in which we try to use this. That's maybe a little less obvious than something like certification, where you're really just like creating some new categorical signal that didn't really exist before and eliminating the continuous one.
So in the interest of time, let's perhaps talk about one last topic, and I think this one has already come about in previous discussions I had with Dr. Hoffman, because it's really one that evolutionary psychology specifically doesn't seem to tackle very well. How and why do people develop passions?
No, you just taught this. This one's on you.
No, yeah, but as he said, he's already heard my take before, so I guess it would be good to hear you explain, unless you really prefer me to.
My take is wildly different from yours, so.
Well, your way of explaining it might be different.
All right, he's testing me on the spot. All right, so the question is, we sometimes find people who are super passionate about certain things. They get passionate about things like collecting stamps or playing music or sports or chess or math or things like that, and that passion leads them to like spend hours doing this thing, and they really seem to enjoy it. And the rest of us, they're like, math is boring and I don't really want to spend my time that way. So clearly the passion is working in some sense, in that like it's getting people to invest in this thing and become better at it. And not all of us are blessed with that passion. Some of us would like to have the passion, but we don't. So you could ask the sort of two very closely related questions here. Why does passion even arise? Why do some people have this passion that gets them to like focus their energies on this behavior? And then also like, why only some people? Why can't the rest of us get lucky and love math proofs? And so that's the question we tackle in the book. And there's lots of related questions to this too that one would also potentially want to answer in an ideally kind of parsimonious way. We address some additional ones, which I'm going to set aside for now.
Before you go into explaining it, I just kind of want to highlight, and I think this is something that Ricardo was hinting at with the way he formulated the question, which is one reason why we do talk about passions is because they're obviously like a relevant and pertinent part of many of our lives. Like we really do try very hard to become, you know, more gritty, or, you know, end up devoting tremendous amount of time to, like, you know, certain activities, and you know, really admire people who do. And it's a little bit puzzling, like there's so much variation in it, like Erez said. But importantly, this doesn't seem to be something that's like really well explained by a more kind of standard evolutionary psychology approach, in the sense that, like, it's hard to imagine that like passions are something that, like, you know, in a simplistic way evolved because of the fact that they're so non-universal, because, you know, what you're passionate about is so culturally dependent, and even within a culture varies so much. And, you know, many of these things you're passionate about are just completely modern. You know, we didn't evolve.
And also many of them, if not, I wouldn't say all of them, but probably most of them don't have any clear link to fitness. So, right.
Yeah,
clear immediate link to fitness.
Yeah,
that's right.
In fact, in many cases, you know, a fitness perspective might lead to a completely opposite result. So, like, you know,
the guy who's doing proofs instead of going to parties is probably like the fitness there is not unclear which one is going to work out better. Actually, very clear which one is going to work out better.
So you know, we some examples of passionate people we mentioned in class are, like, you know, Marie Curie, who you know, died of cancer because she was arguably because she was so devoted to her research on radiation that she exposed herself to it. You know, she's not spending her time, you know, having and raising offspring. She's spending it with, you know, radioactive substances that are killing her. You know, Ramanujan, the same thing. He's got a wife and kids back in India while he's in England working on proofs. You know, I guess he's sending a little bit of money back to them, but he's not even bothering to eat while going to a doctor while he's sick and dying. You know, yeah, from a fitness perspective, there's something strange going on here, and you're gonna have a tougher time applying standard evolutionary psych arguments to explain these type of behaviors, at least simplistic evolutionary psych arguments. Sorry, just wanted to add that context of it. But,
I agree with it. So we're asking, okay, where do passions come from in the first place? Why do they only apply to some folks? And the answer that we give in the book is really straightforward. Basically, we're going to recognize that passions have a cost and a benefit. The cost is time. You could be doing something else. You could be doing something other than solving proofs. You could be going to parties. You could be investing in time with friends. You could be hanging out with family. Ramanujan could have been hanging out with his family. Marie Curie could have been investing in her health or her family, and so on. So those passions have this very clear cost. They're getting you to invest in this activity despite that cost. And there's also a benefit, which is that you get really good at this thing. And that's coming from the fact that you spend lots and lots of hours on it, and that the passions are motivating you to devote those focused hours in a way that maybe you would find difficult to do otherwise. And so the good thing is you got good at this. The cost is, you know, in terms of time and investment in other stuff. And the question is, when is it worthwhile for you to do those good things, to get the good thing at the expense of the bad thing? So, for instance, there are a few things that pop out of this perspective that I think are useful. One is there are certain kinds of activities that really seem to lend themselves well to really heavy investment. In econ, they call these economies of superstars, where only really the very best people are rewarded. And passions are good at getting people to invest so much that they stand a chance of being the very best people. Think of things like in sports. If you want to be a basketball player or a swimmer or something like that, the guy who got second place might be remembered. The guy who got fourth place definitely won't be remembered. My dad was the alternate for Israel's Olympic team in the backstroke. Nobody knows that, right? So he was.
Marie Curie, she's winning the Nobel Prize twice actually, but we don't know who the runners up were. We know her name because she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize. She's the first person to win 2 Nobel Prizes. Nobel Prizes are economies of superstars.
That's right. Basketball, like you either make the NBA or you don't. If you're just on the cusp of making the NBA, nobody will ever remember your name. Scientific discoveries, the person who wrote the paper that got published first, think Darwin versus Wallace. Those are very clear examples. The prediction there being then that passions will get us to invest in, particularly in areas where there are these economies of superstars, and in places where maybe being second best is still pretty good and worthwhile, like being a good friend or something like that. You don't really need a passion for that because you don't need to invest so much that you're going to be number one. It's okay if you're number 2 or 3 or 4. So that's one prediction here, is that those costs and benefits are going to push us to see passions in settings where there are economies of superstars. Another example of this is when we look at the economic principle of comparative advantage. So how are those costs and benefits going to be pushed around a little bit? Well, suppose I'm particularly good at something like swimming or something like doing proofs. And suppose I actually don't have great social skills. Now we've pushed the benefits up, we've pushed the costs down. This is somebody who's more likely to develop a passion. A very stark example of this is Itzhak Perlman, who unfortunately got polio as a young kid, and he says in his in a documentary that we watched about him, look, like my parents kind of nudged me towards playing violin, and I played violin, and it wasn't like I was going to be a soccer player. So he's pointing out, look, my costs have gone down.
I can't remember if you just mentioned this, but the polio left him handicapped, so without access to I guess he was wheelchair bound.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. That is a critical piece. He's stuck on a wheelchair, and he's pointing out, I'm not going. My costs, the value of my time, has shifted in a way that there's certain activities I can't really engage in so productively, and so that shifts my incentives towards things that might be more stationary, like music. And I have a family friend who kind of pointed out the opposite of this when he went to summer camp. Itzhak Perlman was wheeled on and played violin in the final concert of the summer camp, and he was seated next to his dad, and his dad turned to him and said to him, "Hey, how come you don't play like him?" And he turned to his dad and said, "What else can he do?" And so a very harsh way of highlighting this difference between Itzhak Perlman's costs and benefits relative to maybe the average person, one that Perlman himself recognizes. And so we think, even in less harsh cases, we're going to see this. People who are particularly talented at an activity, and maybe perhaps also when that particularly talented also might mean they are particularly talented relative to other people, but also relative to their other skills. Those are the people who are going to become particularly passionate. So even if somebody is quite good at something, but he's also quite good at lots of other things, that's somebody who we might not expect to become a very passionate person. It's really the folks who have these very stark comparative advantages, like the very extreme example of Itzhak Perlman, who we expect passions to arise in. So these are kind of examples of ways in which we use this perspective.
Let me add one more insight if we have time for it. Well, maybe just to kind of tie us back into the contrast with evolutionary psych, which is in many cases the rewards that you get from being this superstar who ends up developing an extreme passion and succeeding at it, winning a Nobel Prize, for instance, or being the world's best violinist or chess player. Oftentimes the reward, the Nobel Prize comes really late in life. The reward is oftentimes, in terms of your legacy. Oftentimes there isn't too much time then to, accrue reproductive success as a result of winning at this lottery. And so it becomes, if it's very important, Erez is talking about the costs and benefits, but the costs and benefits are in terms of the kinds of things that we talked about earlier in this conversation, which we refer to as primary rewards, which include things like legacy and status, that had some evolutionary connection to fitness, but need not now. So it's, the argument we're giving is not that like the passions will always lead to higher reproductive success, or that the cost benefit analysis that Erez is describing is in terms of reproductive success. It's in terms of things like status and which may have related to reproductive success, but need not. And in order to understand passions, you kind of need to recognize that it need not, because a lot of times the rewards are in terms of things like legacies, which don't pay out in offspring.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground in these two conversations. Is there anything you would like to add before we go, or should we end it here?
I think that's great. Maybe just to kind of pitch a follow-up conversations in case you're interested. Erez is currently working on a book that focuses on this applied prescriptive stuff on how to get people to be more pro-social. So maybe if and when your audience is interested in hearing more about that, I'm sure Erez would be happy to talk more about that. And if and when you and your audience are interested in hearing more about some of the kind of experiments we do to test these models, our colleague Bethany Burum, she leads on a lot of these experiments. It could be fun to have her on to talk about some of that stuff.
Yeah, of course, I will leave that on my notes, and just to let people know again that the book is Hidden Games, The Surprising Power of Game Theory to Explain Irrational Human Behavior. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview, and also a link to the first part of our conversation. So Drs. Hoffman and Yoeli, thank you again so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's always a pleasure.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this episode until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there, starting at $1 per month. You also have links to PayPal. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga, Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Dennis Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf, Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whiting, Bernard Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguenzo, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreff, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugnig, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Weira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yassila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Gagi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litska, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, and Sonny Smith. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Van Dam Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Adriano, and Bogdan Kanivat. Thank you for all.